Today is July 26, 2006. I am Jessica Clark. It is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project in Crono, Saskatchewan in Canada. To start with, can you state your name?
Well, I'm Leippi, Wilfred Leippi, but I go as Wilf.
Okay. And where were you born, Wilf?
I was born here in Crono, Saskatchewan on the farm, which is only a couple of hundred yards from where we're sitting here today, on the 30th of May, 1933.
Do you know any stories about your birth?
I know just that it was a very difficult birth. I was over 9 pounds. My mother was about 5 foot or 5'1" or so. I was the fourth child. One had passed away, but I had 2 older sisters. And at the time, the other interesting thing, there was a nurse who came and helped deliver me, but it was on the farm, and I guess the doctor, I believe it was Brown, came and helped in the delivery. It was rather difficult, and at the same time, they were just getting ready to demolish, or I should say rebuild, 100-foot-long barn that my grandfather had contracted to have this big, huge barn made smaller and salvage half the lumber and used it to build my Uncle Gottlieb's farm. So here was this crew of, I think, 10 men coming right about the very day that I was born. So my mother had a family friend, a young woman, a young lady, Elsie Passain, come and spent a few summer months with us, helping her cook and, of course, look after 3 children. It was one of the things at my birth.
You mentioned that you were the 4th child.
Well, I was the 3rd living child, yes.
How did the one that passed away, how did that happen?
I'm not really sure whether just exactly, I mean, she only lived 3 days. And then I did have another younger sister in 1941 who came at the tail end. I mean, I was 3 living, and then I have a sister, Wilma, which is the 4th. And then there was another child that also died. Still, she was actually stillborn, wasn't named at all. The first one that passed away was lived for 3 days, and she did have a name, Irene. Hilda Irene, I guess. Hilda was her first name. Our parents didn't talk a lot about those things in those days, somehow.
Can you share with us some of your earliest childhood memories?
Well, I don't recall a great deal about my very early childhood. I seem to remember a few things. One of the little things I remember was that my parents, of course, or I should say my grandparents, lived close by here, within less than a quarter of a mile. So we would, the 3 of us, me being the smallest of the 2 sisters and I, we would trot over here back and forth quite regularly. And I know at one point it was my birthday, and I think I might have been about 5 years old. And my grandmother had for me a little present, a little gift. It was probably, I can't remember many other gifts at all. We didn't have birthday parties like they do these days. But it was a little horseshoe, a little wooden horseshoe with a little bar across the front. And it was made to hang up a little tie, a regular tie. You hung these ties up. And that little wooden horseshoe, it was kind of unpainted. It was like basswood, I think, a white, real bright wood. And that hung in my closet for years and years. And I don't know whatever happened to it. Disappeared. My mother wasn't one to keep a lot of junk around. And I do recall, I believe I recall the very day that my youngest sister was born, on the 30th of August in 1939. So I would have been just a little over 6 years old. It was harvest time, and my dad and my uncle always harvested together. They had only one machine And I seem to recall us walking across the yard at about noon, and somebody cheering and throwing a hat in the air or something and saying, "Well, you've got another girl," And that sort of sits in my memory. That must have been the day that Wilma was born.
So let's talk a little bit about your family history to start with. On your dad's side, did you know your grandparents?
Oh, very definitely. They lived right here where we're sitting today, in this house, right in this home. Yes, and we knew, they lived here close to us, within a couple of 100 yards. And they did go to Regina for the winter sometimes, but I remember many, many times when grandparents, and we had one uncle and one aunt that were, of course, younger, and we would visit here on Sunday afternoons and maybe stay for supper occasionally as we were growing up, So definitely, yes, I knew them. They'd moved permanently to Regina in, I think, 1945, so I'd have been 12 years old at that point.
So, your grandparents on your dad's side, did they come from Russia to Canada?
They came from the South Sea area, the Black Sea area of Russia. In 1891, my grandfather was 16 years old. He came with a younger brother, 13, and also he was sent along. They wouldn't have sent him alone, but he was sent along with a married brother and a married sister. So 4 members of the family. The married couples each even had a child already, so they settled right here in this area, and of course he came along. Now it wasn't long. That was October of 1891. By April of 1892, only 6 or 8 months later, the rest of the family, the grandparents, that would be my great-grandparents, and the other 6 members of my grandfather's family all arrived. So the whole 10 of them, the 10 were all here within a period of 8 months or so. They all took up homesteads in this area of Crono, LaJord, and the younger ones, when they became married and as they grew a little older, they wanted to have land of their own, and it was becoming more heavily settled, so they went into the Davin area, but that's only 15 miles away or so. So basically they were all quite close around this area. 3 of them were females. So my dad had an aunt that was a Posane and one aunt that was a Renner. That was one of them that was married when they got here, one of the Renners. And they lived on the site where I was born. The Renner homesteaded that quarter, and after 1910 decided to leave the Crono district and moved away to Leader, Saskatchewan, to that area. And then my grandfather bought that land, and that's how we happened to be there. And the last of the females, the third one, married a Wettstein, actually my wife's great uncle. We're not related, but we have common relations. And they ended up moving to Dilk, Saskatchewan.
So your grandfather was 16 when he came over.
Yes.
How about your grandmother?
My grandmother was here before him. Her father was the very first Protestant in this area. He was Michael Beeler and his wife Katharina, and they lived just kitty corner from the section that we're on. It's all very local here. She was 9 years old when she came with her sister, who was 15, and the parents. Here was a 55-year-old man and his wife, along with the 2 daughters moving here. My grandmother says she remembers when she was 9 years old, she heard that there was another group coming from their village in Russia. And she walked halfway to Regina to meet them. And this was, of course, one of them would become her future husband, although she was only 9 years old at the time. So yes, she's also from the south of the Black Sea area of Russia, and her name was Beeler, Paulina Beeler. She lived to be 93 years old.
So did your grandmother or grandfather ever tell you about what life was like in Russia for them?
Not nearly as much, no. They didn't really say that much about it. My mother spoke a great deal about life in Russia because my mother herself came from Russia when she was about 14 years old in the mid-20s, 1923. So she, of course, experienced it. And in our family circles, mother was often saying, oh, well, what it was like in Russia. And us children would say, oh, don't talk about Russia any again. We're sick and tired of hearing about Russia. But she, of course, related many experiences of what life was like in Russia. It was very poor for her family because her father had decided in 1912 to come over to America, to Canada, to try to make, shall we say, his fortune. And he came with his older married brother and his wife, and took along his youngest son, my mother's oldest brother. He was only 12 years old at the time when he came here. And mother and the other 5 children, along with grandmother, stayed in Russia and did not see grandfather for 10 years. 10 years later, during the height of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1921, they suddenly were visited by a man who was arranging false passports and false, fake travel to get them out of this very traumatic situation, stressful situation they were in. Grandmother was living there with the 5 children at the, I was going to say at the expense of, but with the assistance of other family relatives, because otherwise she was destitute. They had slaughtered a cow, the last cow, and grandmother had said, well, when this cow is eaten, we will starve. That'll just be it. That's the choice. And one day, mother told these stories of something I really need to record yet, have some notes about it, that this very distinguished looking gentleman with a beautiful team of horses and a green cutter showed up, and I believe she said it was Christmas Eve, and he asked for this Frau Reich, R-E-I-C-H is the maiden name, is the grandmother's name, asked for Frau Reich, and he spoke with her in secret in the kitchen or somewhere that nobody particularly paid attention, and he had the necessary papers and documents to whip them out of this Bolshevik Russia revolution. The story is a long and traumatic one about the way they traveled in a boxcar, 40 people in a boxcar with a pot-bellied stove in the middle. When somebody died, they just opened the door and rolled them out. And they lived on kind of platforms in the corners of they had kind of like racks built, stilted, where each family would be in this boxcar. And they would be pulled along by a train for a day or two and then dropped at a siding, and Mom said the younger brothers, or her older brothers, I should say, 1 year older, a couple of 2 or 3 years older. She was 12 or 14. They'd have been 15 or 16. They were sent out to try to see if they could beg for some food. And she said she was always so terribly afraid that they wouldn't get back in time before the train left, And they would find maybe 2 potatoes and an onion, and then a great big pot, a great big boiler full of soup would be made for these 40 or so people in this boxcar. It's a story that's very much like a movie that you read, about terrible existing conditions. And in order to try not to trip themselves up, there was a middle-aged couple that were part of this evacuation plan that took on the role as the children's mother and father, and the real mother, grandma, was depicted as being their grandma rather than their mother, and she was deaf and dumb and couldn't speak, and that way she wouldn't say anything and betray herself, you see. And so that was part of the plan that was their evacuation was a result, I believe, as far as I know, of a Mr. Schick. And we met his wife only 15 years ago here, right close to Regina. Mr. Schick was, I would think, part of what we would say an organized Lutheran organization in Winnipeg, which was trying to help evacuate people, from these really bad conditions. And my grandfather would have been in touch with him here in Canada and would have saved money and tried to earn money until finally the point came where he had enough, and then these plans were made to get them out. When grandmother and the 5 children got out of Russia through Poland and into what was later East Germany near Berlin, they stayed for 6 months in a place called Winsdorf. And there were 2 little towns, Winsdorf and Zossen, Z-S-O-S-S-A-N, I think, something like that. And Mother always told us where it was. It was like 15 or so kilometers, just like Richardson-Krono is from Regina. She said that's how Winsdorf and Zossen was from Berlin. And they stayed there for 6 months and waited for grandfather, took a ship over and picked them up and brought them to Canada. So they hadn't seen them for 10 years. That was in the spring of 23. And in 1990, Mona and I, my wife and I, returned. We were on a tour of Germany, and we looked up this little town of Winsdorf, and we took a motel room and said we're staying until we find some information about it. And we went door to door eventually, and we could speak the German language to some degree. We asked if somebody would know. We didn't try to ask for the Reich family because they were only there for a 6-month period. But we asked if anybody would have remembered where the Schicks would have lived. And one woman says, well, my husband is the doctor. He might know of somebody. We're looking for somebody who is 75 years old or 80 if possible, because it had been 68 years from the time that they were there until we were back visiting. And they put us on to a man that they said, probably, one of these people who kind of knows a lot of everything, put us on to this fellow, and we drove over to his house, and he said, yes, I remember playing with one of the youngest children, Max Schick. And Max Schick actually ended up here in Regina later on and was a salesman selling homes in Regina. And he said, yes, I know the house they lived in. Would we like to go and see it? We said, absolutely. So we went there, and it had just been the wall, the East German wall, that separated East and West Germany, had just fallen the previous Christmas season. And we were there in September, October of the following year. And so the people who owned the property were getting their homes back after a 30 or 35 year, a 40 year, I guess, invasion of their property. They just came in and took your property and said, out, we need this house. And so he said this man just got his property back and he's starting to repair it and so on. But would we like to go in and see it? And we said, of course, we'd love to go and see it. So we went upstairs in the rooms that Mother said where they lived for a 6-month period. And that was rather emotional and mind-boggling to think that we would, we always believed what Mother said was true. We never questioned, but it just seemed so far off. Of course, the world's getting pretty small these days. And so we were in the Right House. We took pictures of it and pictures of the churches. There was a church and 2 schools, and we showed them to Mother. But she said, well, the house had shutters. Well, of course, shutters can fall off and come on. And she wasn't able to really identify it, but we were pretty confident that we had the house, and we definitely had the right town. She said it was on the Seestrasse. See is German for See is German for the sea, So it was Ocean Avenue, you could say, or Seaside Avenue. So there it was, Seestrasse, we were on it, we had a motel room, and we trucked back and forth until we finally made the connections.
That's amazing. So, did your mom ever tell you about what her life was like actually living in Russia?
Well, just about the poor situation, you know, it was very destitute. They were very destitute, and the economy was extremely poor. She talked about, you know, an uncle that had a flour mill on the opposite side of the Volga River. They were right on the Volga River. And she talked about an uncle that had a flour mill on the other side, and they were much better off. You know, they had nice clothes and things, and they talked about the good growing conditions that they had. I guess it was more or less like the Niagara Peninsula or like Kelowna, BC, where they grew all the fruits and vegetables. You know, they could grow everything except citrus. They didn't grow citrus fruits, but they grew plums and pears and peaches and apples and lots of melons and watermelons and all those kind of things. So she talked about that. Yeah. And of course, I mean, she talked more about the tragedies that where all the men were rounded up in the schoolyard and all shot one day. You know, those kind of things that are overshadow any little joy or that there might have been.
Did you know your grandparents on that side?
Yes, we knew them too. Yeah, they lived in a little town not far from here, and on the way towards the border at Yellowgrass, Saskatchewan. They had a modest little house there, and one of Mom's brothers, Uncle Ellick, lived next door to them. And so as they grew old, you know, they had one of their children living with them. They didn't get very old, though. I don't think either of them got beyond 67 or 66 or 67 years old. When my grandfather died, or my grandmother? Not my grandfather. When my grandmother died, I played with my two sisters with our brass instruments at her funeral. The band that perhaps you talked to my wife about. I played a trumpet, and my two sisters one played an alto instrument and one played a bass instrument.
How old were you when they passed away?
Well, I think I must have been maybe 13 or 14. Maybe even grandmother would have been maybe 15. I might have been 15. About 48. That's about right. 48 or 49. My grandfather probably in about 46. I mean, that could be, we could determine that, but roughly it's about 46 or 7. And then grandmother actually lived with us in our farmyard here for a period of about maybe a year. And then she went back home, and subsequently she'd had a stroke and couldn't speak. And her communication, of course, was very poor then. And she moaned and groaned a lot, and it got on my mother's nerves. Yeah.
So what was it like having your grandmother living with you?
Well, it didn't bother me, but I saw it really tough on my mom, you know, trying to deal with her. And my grandparents, those grandparents were very, I don't know if I should say old-fashioned, but very, very God-fearing, I think, is the best description. They're very God-fearing, and I wouldn't say they were necessarily very religious, but they were very God-fearing. And Mother grew up that way, you know, with the fear of God in you, that everything you did had a consequence, you know. And of course, the Leippi family were, I mean, they were depicted as being much more economically wealthy. I mean, wealthy certainly isn't the right word, but much better off. My grandfather Leippi had done well in the early years when he came here. I think the economic conditions in Canada here were quite good in, you know, from 1900 to about 25 or so. I know he had one of the first cars in the district and so on. So, and because the children all lived within a mile or so, his 4 or 5 children, my dad just next door, when the 1933, when in the 30s, when the terrible depression came along, nobody starved in this community, because people had little resources and they were pretty careful. Of course, they had their animals and their meat and their gardens and things like that, their chickens and their pigs.
So can you tell me what type of grandparents your mother's parents were?
Well, we didn't see him that often. When we did see him, it would be a Sunday drive down to Yellowgrass, when they were, and of course they spoke German only. They wouldn't have spoken any English. I suppose they could say their name and so on, but they lived rather next door to the uncle, and they were in the blacksmith business, in, a machine shop business. The grandfather, I don't ever remember him working in the machine shop, but certainly the uncle then took over and was very busy in his machine shop. So we would drive down on a Sunday morning, get there for dinner, and visit, the grandparents. And a couple of 3 houses away was the uncle and aunt where they had children our age, and so we would spend more time with the cousins, as you can imagine, rather than with grandfather and grandmother. But they were more the, pat you on the head and, oh, nice little boy type of thing. I would say we had no really close relationship where they would tell us things or discuss things. I mean, they would talk with mother and dad in that short afternoon until Sunday, supper time, and maybe at 7:30 or 8 o'clock you would head for back home again. It was only an hour's drive, but it was a lot farther then than it is today, And that happened perhaps twice a year, that we would go down and see them. And some of the other uncles and aunts that were in that area.
How about on your father's side? How often would you see your grandparents on that side of the family?
Well, up until the age that I was 12 or 13, when they moved to Regina permanently, we would see them probably, first of all, our roadway connecting our farm to the main road ran right by their yard. It just ran right by the edge of the yard. So would we see them? I'm sure we would almost see them every day on the yard walking around. We would stop and say hello, or the dad would stop and talk to his father, Ray, or talk to his mother, or there was a pretty close relationship between my parents, not my mother, but my dad and his brothers and sisters and his family here. So we would see a lot of them. I mean, there were some very particular points at which, like Christmas dinner was always here. Grandmother would have Christmas dinner in this, what was just this part of the house here, and all the 4 brothers and sister would be here, the whole 5 families. Everybody got a gift. Maybe the daughter-in-laws, of which there were 4, they each got maybe it was a wooden mixing spoon, and the sons all got a tie or something like that, So we would see them. We had a good relationship with them. And the one aunt, the youngest of my dad's, the only sister he had, Dad always said, because people would say, have you got any sisters? And he said, well, we're 4 brothers and we've each got a sister. And they said, oh, you got 4 sisters? He says, no, that's not what I said. We've each got a sister, which is only 1. But she was only 10 years older than my oldest sister, So as a result, I think it's 10. She was born in 20, and my sister was born in 30, yeah. So she was only 10 years older, so she was like a little bit of a senior aunt, and we would spend a lot of time, my 2 older sisters and her, and of course I would tag along. We would play games in the wintertime like Chinese checkers and play cards and do jigsaw puzzles and stuff like that, a lot of that. So we saw them We saw a lot of these grandparents because of the close proximity and the age of the aunt. And grandfather would, if it was summertime, he would go into the garden and he'd show up with a little melon, it's sort of a cantaloupe, I guess today we would call it a cantaloupe. Chukamalone, he called it, a sugar melon. And he would have a jackknife in his pocket and he'd slice a slice out of it, and hey, we'd be eating what was sort of like a cantaloupe. A watermelon, they grew watermelons and all kinds of melons in these areas. Properly tended and cared for, you could do it. It worked.
So if you had to describe your grandparents' character, how would you describe your grandmother and your grandfather?
On the Leippi side, well, grandfather was a very placid, very, what do we call the Leippis? They're all very stable. I'm classified as that too, and not irrational. Don't jump to a decision. Think about it. What's the word I'm trying to think of? Just dependable, dependable, quiet, calm, dependable. Yeah. Grandmother was a little fierier, my mother always said somebody had to make decisions, and grandfather, he wouldn't necessarily rush to a decision, and grandmother would say, well, we're going to do this or we're going to do that. But grandfather was very careful economically and finances. He was nobody's fool. He was pretty sharp. He ended up being the administrator for 2 or 3 of his brothers, when they passed away early. And yeah, he was sharp that way. But when I remember seeing him, he wasn't working in the fields anymore, although he wouldn't have been terribly old. He was born in 74. So, yeah, I guess by 44, he was 70 years old when he moved to Regina. So I knew him when in his 60s and early 70s. He was a yard man. He would feed the pigs and the chickens and work in the garden. And they had a car, but I don't ever remember him driving because there was an older brother yet, another son, I should say, Uncle Otto, who was born in 12, and the youngest aunt was. The only aunt was born in 20, so those two were like living at home, single brother and sister living with the parents, and so they did the driving and the field work, of course, and stuff like that. So grandfather was a yard man, and he was puttering around and tinkering around with chickens and pigs, and of course cattle. Yeah, they always had cattle. I know you're going to ask me about grandmother. Mm-hmm. Well, grandmother would always be busy cooking and sewing and I guess knitting, although I don't remember that much, but she was busy in the kitchen. She and Aunt Irma, they would cook up a storm, and of course they would can hundreds of cans of, hundreds of quarts of all the way from raspberries and strawberries to peas and all of the vegetables that they would grow. So there was a whole summer season. They made their own soap, of course. They made their own butter, and so woman's work was never done. You heat it with wood and coal, and that one in itself is a job to keep the fires going and everything. And washing machines, of course, weren't very power in those days. They would. Yeah.
You mentioned that your grandmother did a lot of cooking. Was she a good cook?
She was reputed of being a very good cook. In fact, she had a bum leg. She had sort of, I think it would gout or rheumatism is what bothered her. And so she didn't get around very fast, But she didn't use a cane, but she walked slowly with a slight limp. And she often had often had a maid. Even in her earlier years, she would have a maid, with the 5 boys and all of the work that goes with cooking and washing and sewing and the food preparation, as we're saying. She always often had a maid, and she was reputed as being a very good teacher for maids, I know I've had the occasion to have somebody show up on our yard here about 6 or 8 years ago, a woman that spent 4 or 5 years with grandmother as a maid, and this man wondered if this might be the yard where his mother-in-law had spent with a Mrs. Leippi. I said, "You're talking about Martha Schrader, aren't you?" And he says, "That's right." I said, "Well, this is the yard and this is the house, definitely." So he said, "Oh, what a wonderful woman she was. They treated my mother-in-law like it was their own daughter." So it was a good, I was warmed to hear such a good report about grandmother. Yeah, she was a good cook and a lot of times people would come, I think, to both grandfather and grandmother. To grandfather with economic problems, like, they'd want to borrow money or need to get bailed out of something. And he was in a position to help them, I think, on a number of occasions. And grandmother, I think, was often approached about solving some kind of a family dispute or something, They were both good community, social, active people. And of course, Christian and church-going and very stable in their church life, would go to church on Sundays. That was a given.
How many children did they have?
Well, they had a total of 7, I guess. 5 boys. My dad is William and Alfred and Gottlieb and Otto, 4 boys, and one who died, the oldest boy died, and the one girl and a daughter died. When my dad was 3 years old, he had an older brother who was 5 and a baby sister that was born. So within a month, the baby sister, I believe it was like August, she was born in August, and within a month she had something like typhoid fever or whooping cough was very bad in those days. And it claimed her life. And in late November, the 5-year-old boy got ill and got worse and worse and worse. And finally, during thrashing one night, this is what was related to us as children. During thrashing one night, grandmother said, "We got to do something with this boy. He's terribly ill." So grandfather took him in a wagon with 2 horses and drove to Belgoni, which is about 15 or 16 miles, to see a doctor there. This is where a doctor would have been. See, there was no railroad or nothing. So in 1906 it would have been, yeah. Anyway, Dad was 3 years old, and that boy, the doctor saw him, and when he got home at midnight with the horses, the boy was dead. So Dad said, from a family of 3, Dad and Mother said, we suddenly had only 1, So that's the family. 4 boys survived, and the one sister. And because they had been wanting to have a girl, over and over, never all had these boys, when she was born, her name was Irma Rosa Paulina. They gave her 3 names. They weren't going to have any more likely, so they spilled the whole works on her.
And on your mother's side, how many children did your grandparents have on that side?
There were 2 sisters, an older one, Marie, and my mother was Millie, or Amalia, I guess really, but we called her Millie. And there were 4 boys, maybe 5, just a minute now. Gottfried, Henry, Alec, and Friedrich. No, 4 boys and 2 girls, 6.
So Do you know how your mother and your father met each other?
Yes, I do know. I think it had something to do with the grandparents, knowing his dad was getting to be 25 years old when they got married, and mother was coming 19. I think she was 19 when they married, yeah. And Dad was kind of getting to be a bachelor, I guess you could say, and I think the grandparents felt it was time he got married, right? So they must have heard about, my mother had been working at Sedley in a hotel. She'd been working in Vibank, and she had been working around the Yellowgrass area, helping people as a maid, cooking and baking, and especially in the cook car. She often talked about when they worked in the cook car. You know, they had a car like a big schooner wagon out in the field where you actually cooked for the thrashing crew right in the field. And she often talked about working in the cook car. They must have known something about it. Anyway, Dad went to see her, and my Uncle Gottlieb went along. I'm not sure of the first time, but anyway, sometime I would say in early, maybe late November or early December. And they were married on January the 17th. So I'd say he knew her for 2 months. Or maybe he had known of her before. But Mother once showed me a little box. When she was in the nursing home, she showed me a little box about an inch square. It had a little note in it, not very mushy at all. You know, just to Mother, and that's where the ring was, in this little box. And they were married for, well, from 28 till 82. Well, however long that is, 54 years, I guess. So that it works either way, long courtship or short.
So when you think back to your childhood, can you describe your parents' marriage? Was it a good working marriage, or?
Yeah, it's hard to, you knew that there were some disagreements or difficulties, but I think it was as good as most marriages in those days, yeah. I know that that Mother dearly loved my dad. There wasn't anybody else like him in her eyes,
And how many children did they have?
My sisters and brothers? Well, there's the 4 of us that survived and two girls that died very young.
Can you take me from oldest to youngest, and why you do that? Tell me how the 2 sisters died.
Yeah, well, the oldest was Hilda Irene, and she was born in 1928 in December. They were married in January, and this was born in December of 28. She died in 3 days, and I really don't know the reason. I can't be sure. I still have an aunt. This aunt that I refer to is still alive. She's 86 now. She might remember if I were to ask her. And then my oldest sister is Gertrude, and she was born in 1930. And then my sister Elsie is born in 32 in February. I'm born in May of 33. So we were quite close, 15 months, 16 months, that kind of a thing. My oldest sister breaks the chain. She's gone 76. And my second sister has turned 75, and I'll be 74. And I always complete it, and she always breaks it. I'm the 4th, 3rd surviving. And then my sister Wilma is born in 39 on my dad's birthday. And then the last child was born in August the 15th of 41 and died, I think was stillborn actually.
Can you tell me a little bit about your mom? What type of a person was she? Well, first, what was her name?
Her name was, Amelia, A-M-A-L-I-A, but she went by Millie, M-I-L-L-I-E, is what she went by all of her life, I mean. And they didn't have second names in those days, although my dad's brothers and sisters all did, but he doesn't. What kind of a person she was? Well, God-fearing, very, very clean and tidy, very meticulous. I mean, as she got older, I mean, she would tend to tell you, "Oh, you got to get up and move that chair an inch. You're almost touching the wall, and you know, we don't want to scrape the wall." And she was kind of a little bit high tension that way, hyper that way, and not very worldly, you know, in her age group. Probably learned to sign a check when Father died, you know, but she could read very well. She, you know, had very little schooling, almost none. Probably went to school 2 or 3 years, but of course learned the German language in her Christian instruction, you know, church and catechism and all of that. She read the Bible a lot. Even later she read English Bible. I mean, she read the Bible in English, and she converted and or talked to a lot of people about Christ, you know, and she had a real worn-out Bible, all the little marks in it and everything. Very God-fearing, very, I think didn't really understand or get in touch until she was probably 60 with the Christian aspect of forgiveness by grace rather than not necessarily by action, but she had a fear of God more than a love of God, if you know what I mean. You know, they were taught to fear, and I mean the German language says that you should so fear and love God so that you would do this or would that. And there is an element of understanding that if you fear God, you will not do certain things, like you'll stay away from sinful acts and from places where you could get into trouble. And, you know, you don't frequent places like that. So, yeah, she was pretty, Dad was more easygoing in that respect, you know. But Mother was, I mean, singing all the time. Like, this is where we learned to sing our little German songs when we were 3, 4, and 5 years old. We were singing in church because that was her. She was, you know, that turned her crank, would we say? I don't think so. But anyway, she liked to see that, you know, us kids being involved. And being involved with the church up here, I have to say that, and we're going to look at it later, that when you wonder, like when you say to people like, "Oh, how did you come to Christ, or how did you get to your Christianity?" You have to say, "Well, because our grandparents and parents went there." And this little church that we're going to visit is probably responsible for 5,000 people, whatever degree of morality and Christianity they have. It's because they got the start in that little church.
So your mom, were you close to her when you were growing up?
I would say yes. Yeah. I was the only boy, so I was pretty cherished, you know. I was pretty important. Yeah.
And can you describe what's your dad's name?
My dad was William, although it's Wilhelm, but he was always William.
Did he start going by William once he came to Canada, or did he go by...
Oh, he was born here.
Yeah,
I remember
so
he was born here, yes.
did he always go by William?
Well, you know, between the German and the Englishizing is, I think, what happened. You know, like Bill, he was Bill to a lot of people, too, Bill Leippi. And William, he just went by WM, just WM Leippi. He signed his name William, WM, and then Leippi. I still got one of his 35-year-old driver's license in his wallet when he died. Yeah.
So what type of a father was he?
Well, he was dependable, staid, dependable. You know, never flew off the handle or well, they would yell around the yard a little bit sometimes because you were supposed to hurry up and get the cows, or hurry up and get out here, the cows are running away, or something like that, you know. But a good provider, dependable provider, reliable, he was quite involved in the school board for probably 25 years. He would have been the secretary-treasurer for probably 20 years, was on the church board, you know, would be that kind of a person who would be one of the three church, each, you know, taking their turn, sort of, you know, after a person's been on 10 or 15 years. And he had, although he never had any business, you know, he had business acumen, and did a number of things that Mother pushed him into a lot of things, you know, like, I mean, I don't mean she yelled at him, but I mean, she persuaded him that we've got to do this, you know, we should do this, we should do that. He might have done it anyway, right? But.
So who was the strict one between your mother and father?
Strict. I don't think either one of them was really strict. Not one more so than the other, that I would think. No.
Who would do the disciplining if the children stepped out of line?
I don't think I ever got whipped by my dad or mother. No. Mother would talk loud and, you know, kind of talk you into being ashamed, and Dad would rarely say anything, and if he did, he would really hurt you, you know, if he did. Because, you know, there's things that kids don't think parents know things, but they know everything, you know. I know my dad used to, when I started growing up, I was 14, 15, and started, of course you drove when you were about 12 years old, eh? You drove to Crono. I hauled wheat when I was 13 or 14 years old, and hauled grain and stuff, and Dad would have this drawer with a key in it, and in the drawer would be a glass jar full of change. And he put it there so that I could sneak this change when I needed it. I know that's why it was there, because he didn't need the change jar. It was full of coins, you know, and if you were going and you only had $2 and you knew that, of course $2 was a lot when I was dating, because the show was 25 cents and the banana split was 35 cents. And so if you had $2, you could go to a show and a treat, you know, but maybe you were just afraid that you should have $2.75 with you, or three and a quarter. So you would go to this drawer, and the key was, you knew where the key was, and you would unlock this drawer, and you wouldn't take the whole jar, but you would supplement it with a little bit of money so that you had sufficient. And that way you didn't have to ask your dad for money. Isn't that a sneaky way? Isn't that neat? I think that's really neat. Instead of saying, Dad, can I have some money? Dad, can I have some money? Dad, can I have some money? You know, I mean, a teenager needs to have money. There's no question about it. Yeah. My dad had a very quiet way about him. I know he never told me not to do something. If I had an idea, he wouldn't say, oh, no, that's a terrible idea. Don't do that. I tried that once. He never said that. And my kids today, my son today says, that's what I really like about you, Dad. You never tell me not to do something. My dad would say, well, yeah, it may not be such a bad idea. You have to consider that this could be a problem. Oh, yeah. And there could be this aspect. You know, he would give you 3 or 4, perhaps, shall we say, possible negative problems about what you're proposing to do. And then he'd say, but, well, you know, it probably wouldn't be, it'd probably be all right to try it. And then you'd go home and you'd say to yourself, you know, he posed 2 or 3 really good questions. Like, say I said, I'm going to seed 100 acres of flax, and he'd say, well, you know, flax is really hard. It's very late in the season, and it's very hard to combine, and the straw is very difficult to get rid of. You've got to burn it and rake it. You know, I'm just using this as an example. And then you'd go home and say to yourself, you know, maybe flax isn't such a great idea. I was just thinking of the $6 a bushel I heard and not the difficulty, you know, and that's the kind of a guy he was.
So when you were growing up, would you say you were close to your father?
I spent a lot of time with my father. I went everywhere with him from, I would say, age 10, 11, or 12. You know, if they went to Regina, I'd be tagging along with him. If he went to an auction sale on a Saturday, I was along with him. I worked in the field probably from the time I was 12 or 13, you know, doing a little bit. I know one time he hurt his finger and he got me to drive the tractor, and it was the old model, and I wasn't strong enough to push the clutch on it. But he told me that showed me how I could do it, put my foot against the dash and just take the lever and give it a short jerk. It was a 3-speed with a lever straight up a bar like a broomstick, about that long, you know. And he had to go to the doctor, and he got me started, and he said, if you run into any trouble, well, you just pull this lever and the tractor will stop right, the gas will quit or whatever. And I was, you know, I guess, proud that I could do those things and was given that responsibility. When I was 14 or 15, we painted the whole farm, and I was the guy up on the ladder doing the painting, and I was treated like an adult, sort of. I helped dig one of the graves when I was about 14. You know, the 6 men who were pallbearers went to dig the grave in the middle of the winter. It was like January the 4th or 5th for old man Eitmeyer, old John Eitmeyer. And I went along, you know. I know I was along. You know, why was a 14-year-old boy along with his dad? Because he went everywhere with his dad, you know. Like, I never went on to high school. I didn't really get into high school complete, so I was home from the time I was 15 years old, and I got into construction and building and painting and